Hello, everybody.
Hi, Dr. Nick.
I'll be sharing my latest project, a 1/35th scale model of the Soviet T-1OM heavy tank by Meng model. I picked up this kit from Lucky Model, a website that often has good prices, visible shipping options, and frequent coupon deals. If I find any current promotions, I'll include them below. Inside the box, I found a nice surprise, a contest flyer from a couple of years ago. I really appreciate these touches from manufacturers. It shows some soul instead of just helping speedrunning your microplastic dosing. The best thing you get from these markings is their versatility. They're generally cool and can be repurposed for any other project you might have in mind. The color profiles provided are all based on historical units stationed in Western Europe. One of the featured tanks is from Operation Danube, the only time these tanks saw any kind of action, loosely speaking. It includes a distinctive white cross marking that stands out in photographs. If you're into depicting historical scenes, you could represent some of the protest-related vandalism that occurred. As with most tank builds, we start with the wheels and tracks. Meng's molding quality is generally high, so the parts fit together nicely. The wheels feature nylon inserts like Tamiya kits, allowing you to easily attach or remove them. They're also great if you ever feel the urge to vroom vroom the tank around, if you're a discerning gentleman. For critical joints like suspension arms, I prefer standard plastic cement since it provides a strong mechanical bond. Be cautious though, it's thicker and can cause damage if applied incorrectly. I initially planned this as a quick build, but inspiration struck, and when that happens, you just must follow through. The T-1OM occupies a special place in Soviet heavy tank history. It's the last in the Joseph Stalin series, and in my opinion, one of the best-looking Soviet heavy tanks ever produced. Personal favorites of mine include the IS-3, IS-7, and of course the T-1OM. And let's not forget the IS-2 as well. There's something uniquely magnetic about Soviet and Russian tank designs that always draws me in. For exterior areas, I switch back to extra thin cement to keep things neat. To create weld seams, I apply extra thin cement and then use tweezers or a fine blade to shape the softened plastic. This approach is fantastic for adding subtle surface details. While working on the hull, it's worth pausing to appreciate the armor characteristics of the real T-1OM. Designed to face NATO's heavy armor and absorb the brunt of enemy fire during breakthroughs, the tank's glacis plate was notably thick and sloped, enhancing its ability to deflect incoming rounds. The Soviet approach to armor emphasized simplicity, efficiency, and mobility, sharply contrasting with the Western doctrine at the time. Tanks like the American M103 or the British Conqueror were more cumbersome, designed for static defense roles with heavier setups that often sacrificed mobility to prioritize superior firepower and thick frontal armor capable of repelling long-range attacks. The T-1OM, in contrast, struck a surprisingly effective balance between protection and operational flexibility. Its design philosophy reflects the Soviet emphasis on maneuverability and mass production, a king of the hill versus a dragoon approach, if you will. This balance came just before the advent of heat rounds, advanced guided missiles, and APFSDS rounds, which ultimately rendered heavy tanks more of a liability than an asset. Here's pure activated almonds tip. To clean up sprue gates and mold lines on the wheels quickly, I use a grinding pen with a 3mm diameter shaft drill chuck. This tool doesn't have much torque, but it's enough for this task. To hold the wheels, I carved and sanded a piece of sprue. When applying force with any tool, try to brace against solid parts, like the chuck, so you don't stress the motor bearings or shafts. It's an efficient way to sand all the wheels uniformly. Adding a bit of marker ink to the surface helps track your progress. Start with a metal file for the heavy lifting, followed by a 600 grit sanding sponge for a smooth finish. The footage you'll see is sped up, but it took about 15 seconds per wheel in real time. Try reducing time spent on tedious steps and focus on more creative aspects with the help of tools. The kit's fully articulated plastic tracks are a nice bonus. They offer more realism than rubber, more flexibility than link and length sets, and involve less time cleaning up than metal ones. Each track run has 87 links. Tedious, yes, but worth it. I'll spare you the full process thanks to the magic of editing. Moving up to the hull, you'll start with components like the transmission hatches. Although the kit lacks interior details, the exterior is well designed and detailed. For realistic weld seams, I again use extra thin cement and carefully shape the softened plastic into scale-appropriate textures. This technique also works beautifully for adding weld details around small handles and panels. Disregard the instructions, just assemble the hull. Instant dopamine activation. Almost seamless fitting, but now we are missing the welding strips. So let's go for a 2-for-1 here. It's a simple way to add depth and realism without relying on additional materials. As before, using extra thin cement and applying pressure with a tool always. You don't want to leave fingerprints on the plastic for the feds, don't you? The transmission hatch is functional, which gave me some ideas about adding an interior for a diorama. After some research, I found no readily available interior sets, and I'm not insane enough yet to start designing and 3D printing one from schematics. So it stays closed. Still, it is a cool feature. For headlights or any optical parts that need a mirrored surface, just dab them carefully and let the finish settle. My go-to method, if the lights and camera allow me to show through the bling, is the Molotow liquid chrome pen. For most scale modeling needs, a 2mm tip is more than enough. Looking at the grill, I noticed some minor flash inside. I'll check the thickness. If you're meticulous, you can measure and ensure it's accurate. If it looks fine, I leave it. If not, it's carving time. Using a fresh blade and a lot of care, just follow the plastic and trim off the flash. Don't apply too much pressure or it'll break. This kit offers a good balance of plastic and multimedia parts, great for beginners who want to try dealing with photo etch without suffering from extreme stress. It's a friendly introduction. Now moving on to the guards for the headlights. Some might say you should replace them with copper wiring to earn extra photography brownie points. Honestly, these look fine as is. Unless you want to depict specific damage, I wouldn't waste time here. Just apply a little extra thin cement. If the joint isn't solid enough, or if you're missing welding details and have a gap, you can add a piece of stretched sprue, cut it to size, and shape it with cement. This approach is much quicker than mixing epoxy beads. I think it's easier to use sprue for tiny welds rather than epoxy. Sprue welds are quick and let you move on to other tasks, ensuring a solid, uniform bond too. If your photo etch parts are too stiff, gently heat them with a lighter to make them more malleable. Don't overdo it, as they can become brittle or ruined. Once positioned, gently press them into shape and glue them down. The unditching beam has a nice, molded texture. Some might find it a bit cartoonish, but it effectively reads as wood. The ends need to be refined to look like cut wood. I'll carve and make cut marks. Let's do the same on the opposite side. I also add various nicks and damage to reflect both environmental wear and potential combat damage. First, clean up the sprue gates, then mark the depth of the cuts. Carve carefully, shaping the bark and outer rings to your liking. Also add irregular cut marks to the central part. This is where my quick build took a turn towards a more ambitious diorama concept. I decided to add battle damage and wear, starting with thinning the plastic fenders using the electric pen and carbide bits. It's easier than it looks, but very messy. I did this because I wanted to bend and damage the fenders realistically, and the original plastic thickness was bothering me. Since it's my first time adding this kind of damage, I initially tried using fire, caveman brain engaged. But that wasn't the right approach. Mechanical thinning is safer and gives more control. I'll begin by thinning the fenders evenly along their length using this straight bit. This will provide a consistent base for further detailing and adjustments. With the base prepared, I'll move on to creating focused damage across the fenders. While working on the fenders, I started thinking about their dual purpose. Not just keeping dirt out, but also adding to the tank's ample storage. The storage boxes in particular serve as spaced armor on the sides. You can see the hull armor's heavy wedge shape underneath. It's not thin by most standards, but shaped charges were definitely troublesome to counter back then. It struck me how these parts blend function with form to some degree. What's that all about, you might think? Well, I contemplated fully removing the storage boxes to add some chunky additional wedge armor, but honestly, it's great as it is. If anything, the best course would be to add some mesh add-on skirts and panels. Now, the work done looks like damaged sheet metal, if I say so myself. Now let's make some shrapnel, bullet, and environmental damage on the mudguards. I started with a pointy bit to create these holes, then worked them until they looked realistically thin. If you doubt the appearance now, trust the process. It will become clear as we progress. For mudguard thinning, I switched to a ball-shaped bit to follow the sheet metal ribs more accurately. Using the micromotor creates a ton of plastic dust, which is incredibly messy and gets all over the workbench. For finer holes, I use a hand drill. Against better judgment for bit survival rates, I drill at impact angles, shortening the drill bit's lifespan to single use. I've snapped several already, but they're cheap and easily replaced. I consider that mudguards and fenders often fall off or are removed after damage. Just Google images of IS-2 tanks during the Battle of Berlin, and you'll get it fast. Still, I like how the damaged fenders and storage boxes look here, reflecting shrapnel and frontal fire damage. I might remove them later if I change my mind, but for now, I'll keep them. It helps with storytelling of sorts of what I want to represent. We must not forget to damage the engine grills. I'll use a blade to add different kinds of damage there. You can probably guess where the mood and setting of this project is going with all these bonkings all over. The T-1OM's engine, the V12.5 diesel, was a robust power plant. It gave the tank decent mobility for its weight, but like many Soviet designs, it prioritized reliability and ease of maintenance. The engine grills were a key part of that, providing essential cooling to keep the massive engine from overheating. In a combat scenario, they were a vulnerable point though, exposed to shrapnel, small arms fire, and even potential Molotov cocktails in urban environments. That's why they often show signs of wear and damage in real photographs. Adding a bit of scarring and dents here not only looks realistic, but also helps tell the story of a tank that's been through the ringer. For texturing the heavy armor, I lightly work the surface with the grinding pen to give it a gritty, rolled steel appearance. This subtle step helps differentiate thick armor plates from thinner sheet metal parts. Once the major damage is done, let's restore lost details like screw holes. For damage to the rubber sections, I ensure some rivets are partially gone and that the rubber skirt shows interesting wear inspired by photographs that, despite not being from combat vehicles specifically, they showed interesting damage. Look at forestry machinery for inspiration. For areas that must remain flat, a metal flat file is your best ally as it has little wobbly play. I also added some machine guns burst impacts around the hull on metal sheet parts that can be realistically pierced. This is my first time doing such effects. It's not too difficult, just go for it. With a pencil, I mark shell impact areas to get a rough guide. My concept is that the IR spotlight would attract enemy fire, so I focus more on the right side. To execute this, I use a medium round point soldering pen that somewhat mimics an armor-piercing round shape. I'm not sure if this is standard procedure, and I'm not checking. I try to apply the pen at the same angle as the hypothetical incoming shells. Then I refine the displaced material with a blade and extra thin cement. If you press too hard and make a through hole, as I did, just plug it with Tamiya putty. Shape it with a sprue bit tool. While that sets, I'll switch to a flame-shaped carbide bit for the turret impacts. As mentioned, I focus on areas like the IR lamps because they would likely draw fire. In practice, these would be replaced quickly, I think, but replacing an entire turret for a few dings is unfeasible. This logic fits into the broader picture I have in mind of active combat with resource management, where critical components get replaced and fixed, while non-critical damages are left alone. Using a smaller soldering tip, a C210 semi-hook tip for those interested, I add smaller scratches and damage on the mantlet armor. When all the components are in place, it's easier to see the hole. It's a classic case of missing the forest for the trees, something I often catch myself doing. I recreate the splatter-like scratches where armor chunks might have been displaced with this tip, and then work them with extra thin cement and a blade if needed. For references, look at old target practice photos from the 50s and 60s era whenever possible. World War II references also will do and are easier to find too. The left strap broke off at some point, so I'll replace it with a photo etch strip. I glue and bend the important part first without cutting to the exact length right away. I considered replacing the other strap with metal too, but that would require redoing the buckle, and that's too much effort for minimal benefit. As for sourcing these small metal parts, I just use the included photo etch plate and see if something fits. In this case, the middle section was the right width, so it was straightforward. I wanted some flexibility in the towing cable's position, so I'll replace it with a homemade copper cable. Even if the plastic cable is molded at a fixed length, just overlap it to gauge the length you need and cut accordingly. Now let's free the copper wire from its shielding. I need about half the diameter of the original copper cable. If I wanted, I could replace the already installed plastic towing cable with the other half. Using a pin vise to hold the copper strands together, twist them to form a cable. It's a rough job, but it'll do. Drill the hooks to accommodate the copper and fix with cyanoacrylate. While these may seem like a small detail, towing cables are crucial in real-world operations. Soviet tanks like the T-1OM were equipped with high-tensile steel towing cables as standard equipment, essential for recovering vehicles or clearing battlefield obstacles. For a heavy vehicle like this, a towing cable could mean the difference between abandoning it, risking its capture, or rescuing it with nearby equipment. If some of the copper strands don't align perfectly, carefully trim them like I did. Still, it's always better to take your time and do it right from the start. The result is worth the effort, and it's these small details that elevate the model without having to use very complicated techniques or difficult to source materials. So while I was poking holes around, I couldn't help but think they looked pretty plain and definitely not up to code. Time for a change. I grabbed some references on thickness and hardness, picked out a round bit, and got to work detailing those holes. Depending on how hard the simulated impact was, I tried to mimic the force transferring into the metal, giving the area around the impact a sunken finish. I even threw in some splinter scratches for good measure. It's all about making it look like it's been through some action and made it out so far. The fuel drums need to be slightly dented from things falling on them, driving around, etc. I quite like using this tool to add damage. Great addition to the arsenal. Now for these two parts, I wasn't sure if it was a storage box or a fuel tank. As these things are for sure conformal fuel containers, the way to approach the shrapnel and bullet holes needs to be evaluated. I say this as I started poking some holes, but that's not the way to go. Despite the environment and combat damage, the fuel storage is a critical part to some degree to the survival of the crew and operational strength, and of course replacing the whole thing is easy and probably taken into consideration by Soviet designers back then. I liked how the damage came out on the left, so I will leave it, but the right one will be a replaced one, so it is time to plug some holes, which can be applied to other things too. So I think it's worth to show what I did to fix it back to square one. If you want some environmental storytelling, you might consider adding a patch of weld metal. But would that be the way to go? It's way easier to stripe a busted one out and replace it with a new one. Food for thought. In this case, I'll use stretched sprue and extra thin cement to plug the holes seamlessly. Let it cure, then trim. Another approach is to use cyanoacrylate and talcum or baking soda as filler for multiple holes at once. This method is better for large surfaces, such as the turret basket where I've reconsidered damaging. It's a quick fix that allows to work it again almost immediately. I replaced some handles with wire, so I needed epoxy putty, green stuff, to create welds. While I'm at it, I add details around the radio base. Working with green stuff is simple. Mix it up and use the right tool to shape it. Meanwhile, I refine other areas like lateral handles. This visor is bolted on as far as I can see, so there is no need for welding. The turret top needed a weld revamp. Some areas are beautifully molded, others less defined. It could be a variation among real tanks though. I use light tapping and dragging motions with the blade. If the green stuff is too soft to really get what you want, let it cure a bit and come back later. Just don't forget about it. A bit of picaresque style advice. Only detail what can truly be seen, like the top welding strips of these handles. A few final bits and bobs all around before considering it done. Small fixes here and there. Some front hull flaps unions also needed sculpt rebuilding with green stuff. I considered that these compartments, or at least some of them, would be sealed by the crew in a real scenario for their safety. Let's add some field repairs on the steel. Using this small piece of sprue, let's patch it up. Also, fill some of these holes too. Now add some chunky, careless welds with the extra green stuff I've already had mixed from earlier. The building phase is finally done. Originally, I planned a simple build representing a Cuban crisis escalation deployment, but I ended up envisioning something more complex set in European soil. Transporting these heavy tanks overseas would be an odd choice anyway, so let's keep the conflict and destruction local. The T-1OM is a kit that balances historical accuracy with build simplicity out of the box. While historical approaches would result in a cringy-ass Prague build in the best-case scenario, with some help from Jakub, you can bring out the best in this model and explore interesting stories and scenarios.
Граждане, воздушная тревога. Говорит штаб гражданской обороны. Воздушная тревога.
But Aquaman, you cannot marry a woman without gills. You're from two different worlds. Oh, I've wasted my life.
Thanks for watching to those who made it so far, especially those who sat through the whole thing. I salute you. Anyways, I hope you found some things interesting to try out or inspired you somehow to go and build something, which is what truly matters. Until next time.